Hi everyone, and welcome back to our S5 history class. In the last recording, we talked about revolutions that happened in 1830 across Europe. Some of those revolutions were unfortunately unsuccessful. Some of them were successful. One such successful revolution happened in France. Remember that those who revolted were able to replace the Bourbon King, King Charles X, with Louis Philippe, pictured here, who was proclaimed as the King of the French. Now that in this lesson we're going to talk about another French Revolution. In order to be able to appreciate that, we need to understand that Louis Philippe's July monarchy was largely conservative. Whatever this regime did, it largely favored or benefited the old aristocracy. Now, given that in 1846 France was suffering from severe economic problems, you can understand that, whenever a country has problems like that, it's the ordinary people who suffer the most. So, you have the lower middle classes, workers and peasants, not being happy with the regime. At the same time, you have the upper middle class clamoring for the right to vote. They wanted the government to give them the right to vote. Louis Philippe refused to make changes. He even banned the holding of gatherings called Campagne de Banquet. These were gatherings of people who shared ideas, much like, those salon gatherings during the Enlightenment. These were gatherings where people critical of the government spoke about political matters. People who went there were critics and activists. So, at the same time, the regime also prohibited public demonstrations and strikes. So, a lot of people, you can understand, were dissatisfied with this particular government. So these people who wanted a change, they were successful in overthrowing the regime of Louis Philippe, who was then forced to flee to the UK. Those Republicans who then were able to grab a hold of political power in France, they set up a provisional government. And then eventually the Second Republic would be proclaimed. Now, this provisional government called for a constituent assembly. So this is a body, so a collection of people, of representatives that would be tasked to write a new constitution for France. And those representatives would be elected by universal male suffrage. So if you were a guy, if you were a man, of a certain age, you would be able to vote and choose your own representative who would go to the Constituent Assembly. At the same time, the provisional government also set up workshops for jobless people. But, to give them jobs given the economic problems of France. But this wasn't very successful, and more moderate people in the government, were frightened because something like this, a public program, exhausted the treasury. So France was running out of money. Given that this project was shut down, the working classes revolted. Many of them were killed or imprisoned. But then, fortunately for the provisional government, they were able to nonetheless ratify a new constitution on the 4th of November 1848. So they set up the Second Republic. Second Republic meaning the second one to come after the Republic proclaimed by the French Revolution. They had a parliament, and members of parliament were elected by universal male suffrage. And there was to be an executive, meaning a president who would serve for 4 years. And in one of the greater ironies of history, who do they choose to be the first president of the Second Republic? In December 1848, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the original Napoleon Bonaparte, gets elected, becomes the president of the Second Republic. Later on, after a few years, he would call himself Napoleon III, and he would proclaim the Second Empire, following the footsteps of Napoleon, the original Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, as you can understand, news spread, and the Germans got wind of what happened in France. A lot of people in Germany were excited, and even some of the leaders were open to the calls for writing constitutions, having a free press, ensuring more civil liberties like jury trials at court. So some of these German leaders, they set up what was called the Frankfurt Assembly, a kind of parliament, a kind of legislative body that would prepare for a unified German nation state. So its job was to draft a constitution for that nation state. Members were chosen by way of universal male suffrage. Unfortunately, the Frankfurt Assembly failed. Why? Because its leaders were unable to convince the princes and kings of the different German states at this time to accept the idea that they would have to leave their places, their positions of power, and put themselves under a single German nation state. So, at least at this point, this was a no-go in Germany. On the other hand, you have the Austrian Empire in Central Europe. Now, the Austrian Empire is really was in a very precarious position. Why is that? Because the empire actually consisted of different groups of people, different nations who had their own languages, their own customs, their own traditions. The single thing that unified all of these different people was the emperor, the fact that they were ruled by an Austrian. Now, a big chunk of the population of the empire was German speaking, but at the same time, important positions in government were held by these German speaking people. So you can imagine some resentment on the part of the other people having to live under Austrian rule. So, 1848, in Vienna, there were major protests. Revolutionaries seized the capital. They wanted a liberal constitution. The government, wanting to calm down the revolutionaries, it dismissed Metternich. Hungary was given its own parliament. But at the same time, the Czechs in another part of the empire wanted their own government. Now, if you were the Austrian Empire, this is something that you would want to control. This was something that you would want to limit. You wouldn't want these different parts of the empire to go their own way, because that would spell basically the destruction, the disintegration of your empire. So in June 1848, the empire sends in its military and crushes the rebels in Prague. By October 1848, those who revolted in Vienna were also defeated, and a year later, the Hungarians who revolted in their own area were also subdued with the help of a large Russian army. Moving downwards, you also have the sentiment of wanting a unified nation state among people in the different territories in Italy. Remember that after the Congress of Vienna, there were 9 Italian states. Only one of them was really independent, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. The two Sicilies, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies here, and then you don't see it on this map, but there's an island here, right under the tip of the boot of Italy. Those two territories were under Bourbon control. Then you have the Papal States here in the middle, controlled by the Catholic Church, and Lombardy and Venetia were under Austrian control. But in 1848, people here revolted, and revolutionaries all across Italy also started to rebel and revolt. Of course, they wanted the creation of constitutions, and as the ultimate goal, the unification of the entirety of Italy. But a year later, the Austrians were able to re-establish control. So again, unfortunately for the Italians, a no-go at this point in mid-19th century. So what have we seen here? What we've actually seen here are different events that were propelled by particular political ideologies, political ideas, like, as we've seen before, conservatism or the restoration of order, the promotion of stability, liberalism, a desire for greater freedom in society, and nationalism, the idea that a group of people sharing a language, culture, traditions, etc., should have the right to govern themselves. Some of these revolts in Europe were successful, many others were not. Italy would have to wait for the 1850s until the 1870s for there to be a unified nation state, Italian nation state. Germany would also be able to achieve this goal through war in the course of the 1860s and finally in the 1870s, as you will see in the next lesson.